Hello, I'm Chris Burrell, President of the Magic City Bar Association. Thank you so much for joining us for this final installment of our social distancing CLE series. This has been a great year for the Magic City Bar, and it's all because of committed members just like you. At the conclusion of the CLE, be sure to do 3 things. First, submit feedback so you can get credit for attending the CLE. Second, renew your membership. Third, send an email to 5 friends asking them to join or renew as well. Lastly, be sure to join us for our annual meeting later this afternoon so you can be in the know about what's going on with your organization. We will now turn it over to our CLE presenters. Happy holidays.
Good morning, everybody. I want to welcome you to this CLE and my presentation, 2020 Sports Law Update, So Much We Didn't See Coming. My name is Michelle Clemon. I'm an employment law attorney, an athlete development specialist. I have a master's in sport management from the University of Florida, and a background in human resources. And it's those things that I bring to bear as we have this conversation today. I am not the most technically savvy person, so I'm going to ask you all to bear with me if I struggle or seem to be a bit delayed in moving from one slide to the next. So let's get started. As a preliminary matter, I'm going to see if we can get a quick poll out. I'm interested in getting a sense of how many of you would describe yourselves as a sports fan or a follower of sports. So if we have a way to get that poll up and to view the responses, that would be great. I will give it a second to see what we can come up with in the way of responses. Well, while that is processing, I'll tell you a little bit about this CLE. This is not going to be your typical CLE in which, case law from the past years analyzed and dissected and projections are made about where those cases might take us. Because of the fluid nature of where sports and frankly the whole world has been over the last 9 months, this is going to be about projecting, summarizing what's happened to date from and the legal implications of sports in all these different ways that it's been affected. And then trying to make some projection based on that, where things will go, with there not really having been any case law established around these matters I'm going to be talking about. I see we have Joseph Petway identifies as a sports fan. That's great. I'm assuming there are probably some more sports fans out there. If you all want to throw that up in the chat. I cannot vote, but yes. Would you describe yourself as a sports fan or not? I'm very, very curious. I can't vote, so I'm going to close that out. And I'll wait to see what those results are. In the meantime, let's get started. In brief summary or overview, we're going to talk about 3 sports-related topics today. The legal implications of COVID-19 on sports, the legal implication of this surge in athlete activism that we've seen in sports over the last 6 months in particular, and the developments in the right of publicity and name, image, and likeness specifically over the course of this past year. Listen, there's so much more we could talk about, but in the interest of time, I'm going to pare it down to these 3 things and we'll go from there. Let me move this over a bit. So if you see this image here, I snagged it from the Sports Illustrated cover that must have come from sometime in July. It says sports are coming back, and if all goes according to plan soon, some alterations to the landscape will be temporary, but many are likely to last. And here are things to get used to, 10 things to get used to. Game changed. Well, the game has certainly changed over the last 9 months in particular. And the thing that has perhaps most changed this landscape, as we all know, is COVID-19. And I don't need to spend much time talking about the toll that COVID-19 has taken on the US and on the world over the last 12 months. Worldwide, as of a couple of days ago, there were just about 68 million cases, about 44 million people had recovered, and there had been millions of deaths. In the US, 15 million cases and a little shy of 300,000 deaths. In Alabama, 275,000 cases and around 3,900 deaths. And I want to take the time at this point to express my deepest condolences to anybody who's been affected by COVID, whether that's having experienced it yourself or having lost loved ones to COVID. So what we're here to talk about today is COVID and the impact on sports. But the reason why it's an important topic to address is because of the financial implications that not playing sports potentially has on the sports industry. So I thought I'd show this brief video that provides a summary of what that financial impact would be.
The game tonight has been postponed. It began with the NBA on March 11th.
Breaking news from the NBA, the league has been suspended. The men's and women's tournaments, along with all winter sports, have been canceled.
Just like the NBA, the NHL has suspended this season.
6 weeks later, the economic devastation of a world without sports is coming into view.
Our revenue, in essence, has dropped to zero.
We just have never seen anything on this scale. As an economist, you stand back, you look at the carnage that's taking place, dumbfounded, awestruck, mind-numbing.
Patrick Risch of Washington University in St. Louis conducted an analysis for ESPN. He estimates the shutdowns of professional, college, and youth sports alone will cost at least $12 billion to an industry that generated more than $100 billion a year before the pandemic.
Could we see a 15 to 20% reduction in those revenues and spending related to sports by the time this is all said and done? I absolutely think that is very safe and very conservative to estimate.
Not including football, Risch projects $5.5 billion in losses for the other major pro sports, another $3.9 billion for colleges, 2/3 of that for March Madness alone, and an additional $2.4 billion for youth sports. That total is nearly $12 billion. And the numbers grow with losses from NASCAR, golf, tennis, and other sports. The most lasting damage of the crisis might be to the $19 billion youth sports market, which drives billions in tourism revenue to many small communities.
You lose 2 months, 3 months of youth sports tournaments. That's registration fees. That's parents not spending money on hotels, restaurants in these towns.
Get hot dogs here, hot dog.
Job losses in sports are expected to be staggering as well. EMSI, an analytics firm, says the industry supports 3 million jobs. Already, hundreds of thousands have disappeared. Rish's analysis is conservative. It assumes the NBA and NHL won't be able to complete their regular seasons, and that baseball and pro soccer will only get in half their seasons, and can do it with fans.
LSU sits on the throne of college football.
And then there's the king of sports, football. A season without college football and the NFL would wipe out more than all the other sports combined.
The impact on football, when you look at the lost media revenue, the lost sponsorship revenue, we're talking tens of billions of dollars if we lose a significant portion of the football season.
Thank you for watching ESPN on YouTube.
So when we talk about why sports is continuing, that video sums it up pretty well, right? Like, you understand that we're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars at stake if sports don't proceed. And so in talking about this topic, specifically around COVID, there are a number of things that employers are looking at and examining, these teams and leagues are looking at with regard to how to proceed. Those areas include team and league safety, avoiding any workplace discrimination claims, making sure that workplace leave policies are consistent and equitable. And finally, we're going to give some thought to what the collegiate space looks like in light of COVID, and how administrators and how coaches and players fit into the how to respond, the appropriate response. First, I want to spend a little time talking about the workplace safety piece of it. If nothing else, if employers don't have, most employers do, and most sports and teams and leagues do, they're going to have health and safety policies and practices. But in the absence of those, the overarching rule or law that governs workplace safety is the Occupational Safety and Health Act, and the general duty clause of that act, which states, each employer shall furnish to each of his employees employment and a place of employment which are free from recognized hazards that are causing or are likely to cause death or serious physical harm to his employees. And so what we've seen since the NBA precipitously stopped its season on March 11th is each league, each team, each college team and conference attempting to, whether they're obligated or not, attempting to fulfill this requirement. How do you keep players on the field of play safe, and how do you make sure that they're engaging in conduct off the field that is consistent with risk mitigation? And so that's the fundamental question. What efforts are teams taking to mitigate risk by implementing social interaction protocols that lower exposure, and testing and contact tracing protocols that identify positive cases and their close contacts? And so I think as an example of this, I'd like to show kind of a video that reflects the current challenges that teams and leagues are facing.
We are going to continue now with the growing COVID crisis in the NFL. After more positive tests leave teams scrambling, 2 teams now fined for violating safety protocols, while the Denver Broncos were forced to start a rookie wide receiver at quarterback. TJ,
yes.
explain.
Okay, a rookie, undrafted wide receiver who's never played a single game in the NFL and who a month ago had a sales job. That's who started at quarterback for the Denver Broncos yesterday. That gives you an idea of the desperation, though, that teams and the NFL are feeling, and we are seeing more than ever the chaos that COVID is having on this NFL season.
Coronavirus cases rising in the league, safety protocols being violated. So the NFL this morning is cracking down, issuing fines and even launching investigations against two teams. One, the Baltimore Ravens, the other, the Denver Broncos, who were facing a nightmare scenario this weekend. Every single quarterback on the roster was ruled ineligible to play in Sunday's game for violating COVID protocols and were deemed high-risk close contacts.
We count on them to be the leaders of the team. Those guys made a mistake, and that is disappointing.
But that nightmare for the team may be a dream come true for one player. Here is Kendall Hinton. Undrafted rookie wide receiver Kendall Hinton tapped to fill in as quarterback. Hinton had been working a sales job just a month ago and had never played an NFL game before yesterday. He got the call late in the day, Saturday.
Coming in, we knew it would be a tough situation for sure. It was a challenge I was wanting to take on.
Hinton and the Broncos went on to lose to the Saints. The Saints were fined $500,000 for not wearing masks during a celebration 3 weeks ago.
We just have to stay the course and continue to remain vigilant. We can't get COVID fatigue here.
And for the Baltimore Ravens, more bad news. For the 8th straight day, a player tested positive. 23 players in all now. For now, their Thanksgiving Day game against the Steelers is being moved to Tuesday. And for now, it's still on.
The league has stopped for nobody and nothing. The league continues to put out these games that are entertainment on the weekends for a country that probably can use some at this point in time.
So there's the question, guys. Why continue to push forward with all these cases? The league has built in an extra week at the end of the season in case they had to cancel a game. So they gave themselves a little leeway because they're trying to stay on schedule for the Super Bowl, which is February 7th. So they built some time in. Let me take a moment, Kendall Hinton, and commend that young man.
I'm with you there.
He got a call at 4 in the afternoon Saturday saying you're going to start at 4 in the afternoon tomorrow for the Denver Broncos. At quarterback, he learned 20 to 30 plays. He didn't even know all the guys on the team, right? He's in the huddle. Hey, I'm Kendall. Good to meet you. Go long.
Go long.
But
First round, yeah.
Good for him. Good for him.
All right, TJ, thank you very much.
Well, hey there.
So time for another poll. My question to the group is, in light of the video you've seen, and they referenced the Ravens and Steelers game. That game was originally scheduled for, that was supposed to be the primetime game on Thanksgiving night. Because of a COVID outbreak that the Ravens were experiencing, that ultimately even impacted Lamar Jackson, its MVP quarterback, that game got postponed no fewer than 3 times, if I'm not mistaken. It went from that Thursday to Sunday to Tuesday to being played last Wednesday at 2:40 in the afternoon. So the question is, in light of what you know and your following of sports, and your being lawyers, what's your sense of, for the most part, what's your sense of whether the NFL should have put a pause on the season, given the number of outbreaks? Waiting for those results to come in. I'm very curious to see what the group says. So we have 69% saying yes, and 31% saying no. I truly wish that this were more interactive and we were in like a crowd setting where we could kind of talk this through some. I'd be curious to hear some of your thoughts on it, but we're going to move on as soon as I can get this mouse to work. Here we go.
We are going to continue now with the growing COVID crisis.
And I told you I would have technical challenges, and I do. So, here are the key issues that teams and leagues are facing. One of them is the liability for players contracting the virus. We know that there are efforts that are part of the holdup of a bill a relief bill that's being negotiated in Congress is that the GOP sect is seeking to have provisions that shield employers for liability for COVID exposure. And that's been a sticking point that's made getting a deal done a challenge. You know, another big issue that teams have to consider, and we're going to get into it in a deeper way in just a second, is this vaccine administration piece and whether it can be compelled. And I also added to this slide something that's less of a legal issue, but more of a moral question around should leagues and teams be prioritized in getting tests over healthcare and essential workers who are struggling to even have the number of tests they need to make sure that they've not contracted coronavirus. And so the question around vaccine administration for teams and leagues really gets us into another space of employment law, which is workplace discrimination. We've talked about the health and safety piece, but now we're getting into the workplace discrimination piece. And what I really want to drill down on in this time that we have, I'm kind of blowing through this stuff in light of my tardiness. I want to talk about specifically the implications for the American Disabilities Act and Title VII, the Civil Rights Act 64, Title VII, religious accommodation. This is going to probably be the big sticking point for teams and leagues, is the vaccine question. With a more typical employer, we do have case law relative to requiring the flu vaccine. So I would imagine those cases will be kind of comparable to and will largely drive the precedent that's established in the inevitable cases we're going to see around compelled COVID-19 vaccine administration amongst employers. At the end of the day, there can be that you cannot get an accommodation for merely having fear of getting COVID. You have to have, under the American Disabilities Act, you have to have a disability that affects a major life activity. And so that, along with the religious accommodation requirement under Title VII, I think you're going to see that there are going to be athletes who say, particularly who say on the religious piece, I have a sincerely held religious belief that restricts me from taking the vaccine. It should be interesting to see where those cases go. Now, I'm toggling back and forth between religion and disability. I think from a disability standpoint, these players get tested out the wazoo anyway, just as a matter of to be medically cleared to play. And this was the case before COVID hit. I do have a question around, to the extent that there are players that have hypertension and diabetes and other heart disease related issues that disproportionately affect the Black community. What is the likelihood, or what are the chances that players will be able to receive some form of accommodation, not because they have COVID, but because they have a comorbidity that may make their experience of COVID more severe should they catch it? So it'll be interesting to see how that develops. I am fairly confident that we're going to see this challenged on some level. So that's something to keep an eye out. Whether back to the religious piece, whether the religious belief is sincerely held, I think, it's always kind of a cornerstone issue in those cases. So we'll see what becomes of that, but those are things to be on the lookout for as we go into as these football leagues start their new seasons. We have the NBA starting in a couple of weeks. It'll be interesting to see how these accommodation issues get played out. And on a related note, we have the issue of taking of leave policies. Obviously, the Family Medical Leave Act allows for eligible employees to take up to 12 weeks of unpaid leave. I'm sure that the leagues have negotiated with the union what leave looks like for their players. But you cannot get leave, again, like in the same instance with accommodations for disability or religious belief. You can't take leave just because you have a fear that you'll contract COVID. The NFL, for example, has opted at an opt-out option that it negotiated with the union for the season that started back in August or September. They had to opt out by August 3rd. They received a stipend from the owners, and there were two categories of stipend of leaves: opt out voluntarily or medical opt out. Thus far, you had 63 players who opted out of playing for the NFL this season. You know, a starting roster is 53, so you had basically a team plus a few to spare who opted out of playing because of COVID. It'll be interesting to see, particularly as more data gets acquired and more information learned around the long-term effects of COVID. It'll be interesting to see if we have even more players opt out during next year's NFL season. Wanted to show this video because it's germane to where we are in this moment. The NBA season starts in a couple of weeks. And this video gets into kind of the status of where some NBA players are with regard to playing.
48 NBA players tested positive for COVID-19, the league said on Wednesday. It had tested hundreds of players as part of what it's calling an initial return to market testing phase. The players are returning to their team's home markets to get ready for the 2020-2021 season set to start later this month. The league's only non-US team, the Canadian Toronto Raptors, are the exception. They face tight international travel restrictions and will start the season in Tampa, Florida. Across the NBA, individual player workouts start this week and group workouts begin Sunday. Last season's bubble environment at Walt Disney World faced few issues protecting players and staff from the coronavirus. But the upcoming season faces many of the same challenges as other sports leagues in a landscape thoroughly upended by the pandemic. Both the National Football and Baseball leagues grappled with game postponements and positive COVID-19 cases as athletes traveled from city to city. Hospitalizations in the U.S. hit a record number for a fourth consecutive day this week as COVID-19 cases soar.
So it's time for another, I'm going to try to get out of this slide. So it's time for another question before I get into the collegiate piece. How many of you think that employers should, or these teams should require employees to get the COVID vaccine? Just waiting for the results here. Hope they'll come up pretty soon. So we have 59% saying no, employers shouldn't require employees to get the vaccine, and 41% saying yes, they should. Okay, very interesting, very interesting. Well, the other area, we've talked about how COVID has some of the areas in which COVID has affected professional sports. There's a separate conversation to be had around how it's affected the collegiate space. I thought I'd share this video from Coach K from Duke after they lost pretty soundly to a non-conference team on Wednesday. The timing of these comments aside, I thought Coach K had some fairly interesting things to say about student athletes playing at this time.
got my butt beat by a lot. So anything, I don't think it feels right to anybody. I mean, everyone is concerned. You know, we made an assessment, or I'm not sure who leads college basketball. You know, it's done by committee. You have oversight committee, you have this committee, and anything that's led by committee is not agile in handling a situation. And so we made an assessment and there was a consensus. It wasn't like well planned that we're going to start November 25th. And that was made without knowing if there was going to be, where the vaccine was, how many cases, you know, and basically it was more of a mentality of get as many games in as possible. And I would just like for the safety, the mental health and the physical health of our players and staff, for their, like, to assess where we're at, you know, in our country today. You have 2,000 deaths a day. You know, you have 200,000 cases, 1.5 million last week. You have people saying that the next 6 weeks are going to be the worst. To me, it's already pretty bad. And on the other side of it, there are these vaccines that are coming out that where people say that by the end of the month, 20 million vaccine shots will be given, especially to our healthcare, to the people who need it. And by the end of January or February, another 100 million. Well, should we not reassess that? You know, and you know, see what would be best. What would be best. And look, I'm going to do whatever they say. We're going to make the most out of everything we say, everything that's done, you know, that's said. But yeah, it's a different time. It's just a different time. And
so yeah, Coach goes on for some time, but that's the germane part of the video. I thought I'd show it. You know, it poses the question, like, should whomever is in charge of collegiate sports be allowing this to go on? And it's a good question. It's a timely question. And I have my own personal opinions about it, but I'm not on this CLE to share those. But I will get a little bit more into what I see as some of the, you know, the collegiate considerations that make it a little different from the professional space. You know, for one, students don't have the protection of a union. The student athletes don't have, at this point, the protection of a union, so they can't negotiate the conditions of their playing because they're not working. They can't negotiate those. Student athletes also face the specter of, if they opt not to play because of COVID, while they might, you know, while they can retain their eligibility or push that eligibility for another year, their scholarships aren't guaranteed. And I think you've seen that happen to a certain extent, where football players have had concerns about playing, have opted out, and as a result have lost their collegiate scholarships as a result of it. But perhaps the most concerning aspect for student athletes and COVID are the unknown long-term effects that we're really just now trying to get a handle around. We know that we don't know the numbers because teams aren't disclosing them voluntarily, but we know that COVID has run through a number of college programs, regardless of size, and specifically some high-profile Power 5 programs. We know that the NCAA is adjusting its March Madness geographic plan. Now it's going to kind of try to host, it's hard to call it a bubble, but they're going to host all of the NCAA March Madness games in Indianapolis. And then because there's this health concern, there's a concern around super spreader events. There's increasing evidence, and there are increasing numbers of cases of student athletes being diagnosed with COVID-related myocarditis. Just in the past couple of weeks, or in the past week in particular, we've had two players, Vanderbilt women's basketball player, Demi Washington, isn't playing this season now because of COVID-related myocarditis. And just in the last couple of days, the University of Miami's football team player, Al Blades Jr., has had to sit down for the rest of this season because of COVID-related myocarditis. So these are tremendous long-term, potentially long-term health issues that these young people are enduring. A question from a legal standpoint, obviously, is there would there be a viable negligence claim somewhere down the road for them? And the counter question of that is that, can you make the argument that they assumed the risk? And how viable is that defense when they don't have a voice and they don't really have a lot of negotiating power? So these are all things that I'm projecting will, as we learn more about COVID, as we may be more likely to see more student athletes being sidelined for COVID-related health reasons. These are the types of issues, particularly around negligence and assumption of risk, that I think we're going to be hearing more about. In the interest of time, I'm going to blow through these remaining slides. So we've talked about COVID, the year in sports, and how COVID has affected sports. The other pandemic we had that's occurring in this country is one around race. And we specifically saw the sports world react to that pandemic in ways that one might have never imagined. And so I'm going to spend a little time, very little time, touching on kind of the legal implications for what we saw going on from a protest standpoint and the impact it's going to have in the long term. Yet again, another video to summarize kind of where players stand on the issues that have arisen since the murder of George Floyd in May.
On behalf of ourselves and our team, we're going to place a statement as a team today.
NBA players are sending a message after a national outcry. It all started after the Milwaukee Bucks announced they would be sitting out their scheduled playoff game Wednesday night.
We are expected to play at a high level, give maximum effort, and hold each other accountable. We hold ourselves to that standard, and in this moment, we are demanding the same from lawmakers and law enforcement. We are calling for justice for Jacob Blake and demand the officers be held accountable.
The Wisconsin-based team is reacting to police shooting 29-year-old Jacob Blake in Kenosha. Witnesses said Blake was attempting to break up a fight when police arrived at the scene Sunday night. Blake was shot by a police officer 7 times. Other players from the league have taken to social media to express their outrage. LeBron James tweeted, "This man, we demand change. Sick of it." Denver Nuggets player Jamal Murray said, "We demand justice." WNBA players are also making their voices heard.
After speaking with representatives from teams playing tonight, as well as our WNBPA leadership, the consensus is to not play in tonight's slate of games.
Atlanta Dreams player Elizabeth Williams announced the entire league would not be participating in games on Wednesday night.
We stand in solidarity with our brothers in the NBA and will continue this conversation with our brothers and sisters across all leagues and look to take collective action.
In a chilling moment, players from the Washington Mystics were seen in T-shirts that spelled out Jacob Blake's name. The back of the shirts featured images of bullet holes. Wednesday just so happens to coincide with the anniversary of a pivotal intersection of sports and activism. It's exactly 4 years after former NFL player Colin Kaepernick protested during the national anthem for the first time.
I think the biggest thing now is to kind of, as a black man, as a former player.
And sports broadcasters have even taken to showing their support. Commentator Kenny Smith opened up about the NBA strike during a taping of Inside the NBA, which he concluded by walking off the set.
I think it's best for me to support the players and just not be here tonight.
So that gives some sense of how impacted the players have felt by acts of police brutality that have occurred around the world. We know that in August, during the NBA's resumption of play in the bubble in Orlando, in reaction to the Jacob Blake shooting, the Milwaukee Bucks, who were at the top of that video in the group press conference, they effectively initiated a work stoppage that blossomed and bloomed into the entire sports world, and players in all the major leagues taking a day, at least one day of work stoppages. Obviously, under the National Labor Relations Act, employees have the right to strike. Some people call that a boycott, what the Bucks precipitated. That was a wildcat strike that isn't allowed by the National Labor Relations Board. What is fascinating about that work stoppage was, again, that other leagues followed suit, and that it was a highly risky proposition for the players who did it. They could have been, they had violated their employment contracts. They had stepped outside of the terms of the CBA. There could have been serious repercussions for them for doing that. But the third thing that's unusual about it is that the management didn't seek punitive measures. Now, obviously, they would have seemed cold-hearted had they sought punitive measures given the circumstances under which they were protesting. But it's a very interesting concept of using a work stoppage to bring attention to an issue that's outside of that, that's more of a societal issue. And on that note, my final poll question to you all is, do you think there will be another work stoppage comparable to what we saw this summer in major sports? Let's see what these results bear out. What do we have here? It looks like the results are coming in. Yes, so wow, almost 75% of folks think, well, over 75% think that there will be another work stoppage in sports, and the balance thinking no. Well, that's very interesting. We shall see. I think that whether that happens is largely a function of the overall tone and tenor of the country, but it will be interesting to see how it plays out. Very quickly, activism in sports, there are First Amendment implications to it. We've heard a lot around players asserting that it's their First Amendment right to speak out. And the answer to that in the context of their employment with an private employer is no, you don't have unfettered rights to speak out. The First Amendment and the right to speak freely applies to state and federal actors. And so when players need to understand that if they are working for a private employer, which the NFL is, or their teams are, they don't have unfettered freedom of speech. Perhaps where the speech occurs, one could make the case that what they're doing, they're like protesting here as Kaepernick and Eric Reed are, these stadiums are quasi-public spaces. So there have been attempts to make an argument that under certain conditions, a player protesting, a player who works for a private employer, but protesting in a quasi-public space may have some free First Amendment coverage if somehow the private employer is somehow a state actor in that moment. It's a stretch, but that argument has been made. The other relevant topic around activism in sports is this notion of retaliation. Obviously retaliation is seeking adverse employment action when after an employee is engaged in some form of protected activity. There's some case law that suggests, I think the Thompson case in particular, that suggests that third-party retaliation claims are viable, so that you could theoretically make the case that Colin Kaepernick could have a viable third-party retaliation case in reaction to his protest causing active NFL employees to protest, and amongst their protest, raising concerns of discrimination within the NFL. If they are retaliated against for his protests and their protests, that's retaliation. And if he experiences injury as a result of NFL not hiring him, which has been the case, then he could have a viable third-party retaliation claim. It's kind of circuitous, but it's an interesting something to keep track of. I know that he and Eric Reed settled their collusion grievance against the NFL, but the retaliation piece, in my mind, and viable Title VII pieces remain viable for Colin Kaepernick unless he's waived them. They remain viable as long as an NFL team continues to hire or put on their roster quarterbacks who aren't as successful, don't have the historical success that Kaepernick has had. Really quickly, because we're coming down to the wire, the name, image, and likeness developments this year. Late last year, the California Assembly signed and enacted, and the Governor Newsom signed off on a Fair Pay to Play Act that allows players to be paid for their right of publicity. So this isn't compensation from, and this applies only to public institutions in California, not private ones. But it would allow for those players to get paid, to get paid endorsements. This would not go into effect until 2023. The interesting development this year is that I'm going to blow past these videos. The interesting thing is that this year, the NCAA, in an effort to jump ahead of it, is trying to come up with its own proposal around how players might get compensated for their name, image, and likeness. The interesting thing, at least my understanding, is that part of what the NCAA would propose is that players can get paid for their endorsements, but the endorsements, the player could not wear his or her school's paraphernalia in the endorsement. So they'd have to be completely disassociated from the institution, which is an interesting control tactic in my part. Ultimately, I think that this particular effort will likely end in litigation. It seems pretty clear the NCAA, is having to acknowledge that these issues around right to publicity, they're not going away. They want to control the narrative as much as they can around it. Ultimately, and because there's such bipartisan support, and other states have enacted similar fair pay to play legislation or are planning on doing it in an upcoming terms. Maybe this doesn't end in litigation, but I'm not confident that it won't, given that even in trying to make concessions, the NCAA is still largely trying to control the narrative around how players can get paid on one hand, but still try to classify them as amateurs. I'm sorry for having to blow through the last half of this presentation, guys. I want to thank Chris and the MCBA for inviting me. I hope you all have a fun and safe holiday season. And I want to again thank you for your time. Here's my information. These are the means through which you can contact me. I'd love to hear from you, discuss these issues offline, and hope you have a good one.
Hey, Michelle, this is Chris. Let me interject for a quick second. Thanks again for doing the CLE. This was great. I really, really, really enjoyed it. But we do have one question I wanted to go ahead and throw out to you and see. Jennifer Bittner asked, how feasible do you think a bubble is, i.e. like the one the NBA implemented? How feasible do you think that is for other sports? Is that a good way for teams and leagues and other sports to comply with the health and safety laws while still allowing sports to go forward?
Yeah, that's a great question, Jennifer. I think that the bubble concept is a good one. I'm not sure it's as feasible. I think we had lightning in a bottle with what the NBA was able to accomplish over a contracted bubble experience. I don't think it's a viable option it's viable for the NBA in large part because of the size of their teams. You have squads of 15 versus squads of, an NFL an NFL squad is full squad is roster is 53. So I'm not sure it's very viable for the NFL or other sports or MLB during the regular season. Obviously, as you get into playoff scenarios and fewer teams, maybe that's a more viable option. The NHL did some version of a bubble, if I'm not mistaken. But Jennifer, I tend to think if we talk about the college space in this minute I have left, I will tell you all, I think that the college basketball needs to take a pause already. It's running rampant. They said that they could not, the bubble scenario wasn't feasible for them, and I get that. But with that, I think that collegiate basketball should probably just take a pause, defer their season at least until February or March. I mean, there's a group of folks who are in favor of putting a pause on the season until February or March, and then pushing March Madness into May Madness. But the bubble concept has, I think, limited successful application, and I think we've seen it. The NBA isn't doing the bubble concept for the season that's starting in a couple of weeks, and I will see how long that lasts. I am skeptical.
Michelle, thank you so much for answering Jennifer's question. I don't see any other questions in here, and it is 9:01 at this point. Yes, so thanks again for your time, Michelle. This was absolutely incredible. I enjoyed it, and I'm sure everyone else did as well. I want to remind everyone to make sure you submit your feedback after the CLE so that you can get credit with the state bar. And at this time, we're going to go ahead and end, and our next CLE session will start at 9:30, okay? Thanks again, everyone, for attending. We really appreciate it. Have a great day.